there a prayer that God always answers yes? I'll talk about that in a minute. Hey, I'm Mike. This is Temple on Wheels. Thanks for joining us today. We are on the shores of Lake Erie, about halfway in between Toledo and Cleveland. As you can see, we're at the Marblehead Lighthouse. It's the oldest lighthouse on Lake Erie. It's a couple of hundred years old this year. It's a staple on this, and we're going to talk about staples in just a minute. Last week I didn't do church shout outs because I ran a little long on my message, so this week I'm going to do that. We attended Judson Church in Joliet, Illinois, and the message was about anchors and what is your life anchored to. And of course we know as believers that the best way to anchor our life is to anchor to Jesus. And then last week we attended Keystone Church in Saline, Michigan, on the western side or eastern side of the state, close to Ann Arbor and close to Detroit. And that message was taken from James. They're doing a series in James, and they're talking about James chapter 2 on this particular Sunday. And the lesson was, of course, that famous verse where James says, you can't play favoritism in a church. It just has no place. And that's always a good reminder. It's a simple message, and it's always hard for us to carry out because we always have our favorites, don't we? And they tend to get us in trouble. So my message today is also from James, and it's chapter 1. And it answers that question, is there a prayer that you can pray that God is always going to answer yes? And there is. It's James chapter 1, verse 5, and it says this: if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. So James is saying here, you don't have wisdom, ask. God is going to always give generously, and he's never going to reproach you for asking that, so ask him for wisdom. The key is in how we ask that. James later says, you don't have because you don't ask, and when you do ask, you ask in the wrong spirit. You ask for your own pleasure. The third king, I just had a mental lapse there. The third king, Solomon, got into trouble with that. When he was anointed king, God said, ask whatever you want, and I will give it to you. And Solomon asked for wisdom, and God was pleased with that because he didn't ask for wealth and he didn't ask for fame. He asked for wisdom. So God gave him a double portion of wisdom, and he also gave him wealth, and he also gave him fame. And that's what tripped him up. He got into wealth. He had a lot of wealth. He was the richest man in the world. And God also said that a king should not have a lot of wives, and he had a lot of wives. And all of that tripped him up and moved Israel back into idolatry by the end of his life. So he started well, but we know did not end well. I want to talk a little bit real quickly to wrap up about a verse of the day that I saw from Levi Lusko, and it's the verse in John 6, verse 25, that says, I am the bread of life. So Jesus is telling us he's the bread of life, and his bread lasts, not like manna, which was only good for one day and turned wormy. Jesus' bread lasts. It's the bread of salvation. It's the bread of righteousness. It's the bread of sanctification. So remember, always come to Jesus' bread of life because it brings us eternal life. Hey, I'm Mike. That's Temple on Wheels. Thanks for joining us today.